This is an AQA Psychology A-Level revision video for the Paper 1 topic of social influence with a specific focus on the situational variables affecting obedience. So this part of the specification, it does actually count as an explanation for obedience. It's just separated by one of the other explanations. So just being mindful that these situational variables that affect obedience that you will need to know about and the percentages of how they affect obedience do also count as explanations for obedience. So there are 3 situational variables: proximity, location and uniform. But proximity and location and uniform were investigated by Milgram as well as other researchers that we'll look at. So again, it's being mindful that for proximity and location you will need to know Milgram's variations. So before we proceed, let's have a look at the difference between the main types of obedience explanations. They're situational and dispositional explanations. So situational explanations are to do with the situation the person is found in. So that is mainly the environment and how the environment affects obedience levels. Whereas your dispositional explanations are about the internal characteristics of a person, such as their personality. So as mentioned previously, Milgram's done various different versions of his original study, and you can see the different percentages Milgram found on the screen right now, along with what the variations were. So compared to the original of 65%, so that is 65% of participants continuing up to 450 volts, and all of these percentages are up to that voltage as well. What I would like you to do is pause the video and have a think. Try and choose at least 3 of these percentages that you think marry up with the 3 variations that you need to know. So proximity, uniform and location. Paying specific attention to anything for proximity, because remember, you need to know Milgram's variations for proximity and location. So this is the opportunity now to pause the video and try and tweeze out those important percentages. And in 5 seconds, we will look at them. Okay, so what we have here is Milgram's original, which I said you definitely will need to refer to in terms of situational variables and how they affect that original percentage of 65%. And then the 4 other percentages I recommend you learn are when Milgram did the experiment in a rundown office building. This decreased obedience to 48%. When the teacher and the learner were in the same room, it also decreased to 40%, so that is for proximity. When the experimenter gave instructions over the phone, again for proximity, so that proximity being increased, that distance between authority figure and participant increased, that decreased obedience to 20%. And then lastly, in ordinary clothes, when the experimenter was just wearing casual clothes, that also decreased obedience to 20%. So what you tend to find is all of these situational variables that you need to be aware of decrease obedience. So this is an opportunity to pause the video and make a note of those percentages to try and learn. So now you are aware of the percentages and Milgram's variations, we need to examine these factors in more detail. So proximity, location and uniform. So we're going to look at some other research and also move on to evaluate. So Bickman conducted a piece of research into the effect of uniform on obedience. So you've got Milgram's variation of 20% obedience when the experimenter was in plain clothes, but you've also got a completely different study which was done by Bickman. It was a field experiment that was conducted in New York City, and the pedestrians were the participants. That's why it's a field experiment. So the experimenter or the researcher was in 3 different clothing outfits, 3 different uniforms, and gave different orders to the participants. So they were asked to pick up a paper bag of litter that wasn't theirs, give a man a dime, so some money to pay for parking, and to stand on the other side of a bus stop. So they were all sort of unjust orders, which didn't necessarily have any significance at that time, just to see whether people would obey or not. So we're looking at the percentage column for each of the situations that they had to, that they were given the opportunity to obey or disobey in. What we can find is that people were twice as likely to obey the experimenter when dressed as a guard compared to a civilian, so an ordinary member of the public. So you've got with the paper bag, it was 82% compared to 36%, 20% compared to 33%. I suppose with the dime, when there's monetary value, if you don't have a dime, then you're going to be disobeying. But then also 56% compared to 20% for standing on the other side of the bus stop. So this supports the situational factor of uniform to explain obedience, and it suggests that uniform does convey authority, conveys the authority of its wearer, and therefore people are more likely to obey individuals in uniform. And that is also demonstrated in Milgram's variation in the opposite, where people are less likely to obey because you've got the original percentage of 65% compared to the ordinary clothes variation of 20%. So moving on now to Hoffling's study, which looked at the effect of proximity and orders being given over the phone. I'd like you to have a read of this scenario and pause the video. In 5 seconds, I will discuss the relevance. Okay, so this same scenario was used by Hoffling in their research, and they interviewed a group of nurses asking them this same scenario before they carried out their research, and all the nurses said they would refuse that order. They would not administer a drug on behalf of a doctor they've never heard of over the phone. They said they just wouldn't do it. However, when Hoffling actually did this, he found that 21 out of the 22 nurses did start to give the medication, so went against what they said they wouldn't do. And when they were interviewed after, they said that they were regularly asked by doctors to go against their training and the rules. So the doctor can be the authority figure in this scenario. So bear that in mind, that 21 out of 22, despite saying that they wouldn't, they did. And consider what it suggests about both location, so thinking about where this study was carried out, but also proximity, thinking about the fact that authority figure was over the phone. And what do these results also suggest about Milgram's findings? So 5 seconds and then we'll go through the answers. Okay, so what these findings reveal is that actually location legitimacy, so the hospital being a legitimate setting and the nurses working there, is actually more of a powerful variable than proximity alone, because the proximity was over the phone, but actually over the phone it should decrease obedience, but actually 21 out of 22 nurses, so 95% of those nurses still obeyed the order, and that can be said to due to the location where they were in the hospital. So actually the process of obeying authority in Milgram's study can also be generalised to other situations, because he shows similar findings with location, just in the opposite, that when the location isn't as established as Yale University of 65%, actually that decreases obedience. When in a rundown office building, it decreased it to 48%. So we're going to move on now to the evaluation part of this specification point, starting with the evidence to support the role of situational variables in obedience. So you've got either Hoffling or Bickman that you can use as your evidence, depending on which one you feel most comfortable with. So you use the procedure and findings. Both of them were field experiments, so you can talk about the fact that they've got very ecologically valid findings, and then you further explain the point. So it might make a bit more sense to use Hoffling in this peel, because Hoffling also demonstrates that situational variables, some can be more powerful than others. For example, the point made earlier about location being more powerful than proximity. Nonetheless, research and field experiments into situational variables and obedience are useful because they help us to understand that the closer you are to an authority figure, the type of location you are in and the uniform that's being worn can affect obedience levels. However, Milgram's participants, as remember, you've got to know about Milgram's studies for these variations, They might have been aware that the procedure was faked, that the learner was indeed a Confederate pretending to be in pain, and the evidence from this is Orne and Holland, but you don't necessarily need to use their names. But what you do need to do is show that actually even Milgram himself recognised some participants would have worked out the truth in that scenario, and actually there was a lot of different manipulations, so word would have got round and people aren't necessarily behaving as they usually would. So what does this mean for Milgram's findings? Well, it means that they're actually demand characteristics, and we don't know whether the behaviour is due to obedience or demand characteristics. We don't know whether these participants are actually obeying naturally from the manipulation, or whether they are just trying to help or hinder the experiment that they are part of. And lastly, situational variables are only a partial explanation. They don't fully explain obedience levels. Yeah, I've got the authoritarian personality from Adorno, which will be in a separate video, which actually suggests that people obey orders due to their personality type, due to how they've been raised and their views in society, often developed from a result of strict parenting in childhood and not being able to please parents, so then trying to please and flatter people in positions of power instead. So that alternative explanation might be a better one than situational variables. That concludes the end of this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.